future of electric vehicles is beginning to grow across the Midwest, but there's a lot of work to be done before most people will feel comfortable switching from gas to EV. Ameren, Illinois President and Chairman Richard Mart gives us some insight into how they're preparing by adding more electric vehicle charging stations.
Our vision is to basically have charging stations every 60 miles or so, from Cook County all the way to the tip of the state down to the Kentucky area, and then across the state, east and west, going toward Kansas and Iowa to the west, and going toward Indiana to the east. And so we feel that within the next few years we'll probably add, we're hoping to add 60 to 70 a year over the next 5 years to really complete that infrastructure for the entire Midwest. In fact, the Midwest now has all the utilities in the Midwest are joining together to coordinate that. So, which is the first time it's ever happened that you've had Wisconsin say, okay, we're going to build our charging stations here, and Illinois say, okay, well, we can tap on here, and Missouri, this makes sense for us, so we can expand that north, south, east, and west by coordinating with the other utilities.
Welcome, everybody, to the Ferrario Faceoff. I'm Mike Claiborne. Of course, you see Alex Ferrario, and we have some hockey to talk about, Mr. Ferrario. A very interesting week of hockey for the St. Louis Blues. Let's go back and refresh ourselves about that fun Saturday night in Minnesota.
Fun Saturday night in Minnesota, but Claves, it was more fun for you and I to make sure we're sitting in 70-degree weather watching it on TV. Right. Man, I watched Ryan O'Reilly every time they showed him on camera. When his beard has icicles, boy, it's cold out there. What was it? It was the
-10
professional sporting event in sports history. It was unbelievable. But I don't know about you, Claves, but I thought that was a well put out event by the NHL, especially when it comes to Winter Classics. The game was entertaining as all hell, but the setup was great. I think from now on, the Winter Classic has to be played at night, because that gave me. I agree. That gave me 8-year-old Alex vibes of being out in street hockey when it was ice in the park and skating with my friend.
You know what? It's funny. We all have those stories when we were kids skating on lakes or whatever. And I always used to say I didn't like playing on lakes because, it was too hard, A, to get there, and B, to try and put on skates and everything else. You didn't have a bench or anything. And it was a little bit of an undertaking. But once you got out there, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and I used to, I'm not great on ice skates at all, but what we used to do was we did basically street hockey in the snow. And so it was perfect, because that's when 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boys, that's when they can be more physical with each other.
That's true.
Shove guys down, and you got the snow to fall on. So, man, I used to love it when we were in high school. I had a group of buddies that when it would be snow, and we knew we were off school the next night, it would be 11:30 at night, and we'd text each other, be like, hey, we'll meet you guys at Francis Park. And we'd be out there until 2 in the morning. I think hockey, when it comes to outdoors, needs to be played at night. That was the part that I loved the most in the Winter Classic.
I agree with you. And, when you think about it, it's the worst angle. It's the worst sight line for a fan. I mean, you're so far away from the actual action compared to being at the Enterprise Center, where you can be right on top of it. So kudos to the NHL, kudos to the fans who were brave enough to take on the elements, and kudos to the St. Louis Blues for being very impressive that night. Now, Pittsburgh was a little bit of a different story, but still in all, Alex, I'm not going to really hang too much on what happened in Pittsburgh, because I like the makeup of this team. Now, with that said, COVID has struck again. We've lost a couple of players. We even lost a broadcaster along the way, but I feel better about what's in front of them, because we've seen so many guys step up and assume roles that, maybe they weren't accustomed to, but they seem like they've settled in.
Yeah, I look at Pittsburgh game in a little bit of a different light, Claims. I mean, big picture here, you think about the Blues were playing on the national stage in the Winter Classic, and that sometimes that's hard to move past. Like Craig Ruhe and coaching staff did a phenomenal job making sure that those guys were focused on the game at hand, because it was a big one against Minnesota. You put a lot of energy into that. You're playing outside, cold arena. You pick up the big 2 points that you absolutely needed to, and then you're sitting around for 3 days. And you're like, okay, well, now what do we do? And then you take on a really good team in Pittsburgh that was, won 8 in a row. there were so many factors that went into that I'm like, you know what? Yes, it was an ugly loss and things kind of unraveled in the third period. But overall, it was also getting accustomed to having all of those guys back on the ice. And this is the biggest thing for me, Claves. Craig Berube's talked about it for 2 weeks. Getting these guys back and taking out the Springfield Thunderbirds players, how were the Blues going to adjust to playing that style that was successful, but with guys who play a different type of style? You know, you got guys in top 6, bottom 6 roles that are accustomed to being in a different mentality as a player for the Blues. If you can't adjust to it, it's going to adjust the playing style. And I felt like that's what happened in Pittsburgh.
That's a great point you make. You know, it was bound to happen with so many people interchanging. It was bound to happen. And I think the reason why it happened in the manner that it did, because they were facing a really good team in Pittsburgh. Yeah. You know, I think they can get away with this against San Jose or some other teams on the lower end of the totem pole. But I think when you play a good team like Pittsburgh, you get exposed. And you know what? It's a learning process. I mean, I don't really hold, like I said, I'm not going to take too much away from that other than the fact, okay, we saw what we need to adjust and just more than anything else, adjust to playing with each other in the manner that you speak of. So I'm not going to worry about it because they've got some very interesting games coming up, starting with Washington and some other teams on the schedule for next week. We'll get a chance to see Seattle for the first time. So maybe their timing couldn't be better to come into St. Louis because they're not a very good team right now.
Right. Well, and when these 5 games at home that they're playing, you mentioned Washington, Claves, you're also taking on Toronto, a team that is one of the high-powered offenses in the National Hockey League. And then you got Nashville. Nashville's the team that sits ahead of you right now in the Central and the team that has had your number for the last couple of years. You know, one more thing, Claves, that I want to go back to in that Pittsburgh game for St. Louis that I took away, and I'm sure you're going to love this. I loved Nico Mikkola. I thought defensively he got caught off guard a little bit, but I loved the physicality that he brought, and I love the effort mentality that he brought in dropping the gloves with Sidney Crosby. Now, the problem is he got drawn into what Sidney Crosby wanted him to do. Crosby took a couple of hacks at Mikkola, and Mikkola was like, I don't care that you're number 87 on Pittsburgh. I'm going to punch you in the face. But he made Crosby bleed his own blood, and Crosby turns into basically beast mode and wins that hockey game. But for me, I love that Nico Mikkola said, I don't care who you are. I'm going to do this. The problem was I didn't see the rest of the guys do that. The problem was Mikkola's ready to get physical. You needed the rest of the guys to kind of back that up with them.
Well, man, you're spot on. And that's something you and I have talked about before. Where is the edge on this hockey team? Yeah. I mean, other than in Braden Shen, you got Mikkola, Bortuzzo when he's in the lineup. Everybody else, you know, isn't that apt to want to do something.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that the teams, and I'll give you a good example. You don't think that Washington Capitol bunch won't roll in here looking to, you know, rough it up if they need to?
100%.
I mean, hey, listen, when Sundqvist is on the ice, the mere notion that Tom Wilson's in the building will make him think twice about doing anything. And you know what? That you're going to need that edge somewhere along the way. Now, I'm not advocating that we have to call up some guys going to ring up 200 minutes in penalties, but as a team, you got to be more reactionary as far as when you see things like that take place. Going back to Mikkola, you and I talked about him about 3 weeks ago and how I always felt he should have got more of a look early.
Yeah.
But you had some guys that were playing well. Since he's been up, the combination with he and Parayko has been outstanding. And as I mentioned to someone recently, you don't want to fool with a Finn. You know, Finns don't play that game. You know, if he's a Swede, if he's a Sedin sisters or somebody like that, you know, they'll turn the other cheek and move on. But Finns will give it back to you. And there's plenty of guys who've come through this league who are like that. I look at Jarkko Ruutu. He was a guy like that. And there were some other ones who've come along that don't take a back step. Now, they don't go out looking for it, but they will give it to you if you ask for it. So I like his style. He's a big, strong kid. He's a good skater. He's got a decent shot. I think he's playing a little bit more with more confidence offensively. And you know what? He takes a chance every now and then. But, you know, I think that if you got a good defense partner and your forwards are playing well and they're coming back, you can afford to jump up in a play and make that extra step forward instead of backwards. And I think those are the things that he's going to have to try and figure out, or the guys he plays with are going to have to figure out, this guy likes to jump in a play, so let's make sure we got the back door covered.
Yeah, I've talked with Mike McKenna, former NHL goaltender, St. Louis native, about this a lot. And, Mike always talks about, from the goalie's perspective, what he wants most out of his team in front of him, and he wants communication. And I think that's what Mikkola is learning in this game. Think about what they had when they won the Cup. Pietrangelo, Bouwmeester, Parayko, Edmondson, guys who have been playing together for a long time that knew how to communicate on the ice. Now your top four is Krug, Falk, Parayko, and Mikkola. Four guys that three of them have spent a year together. Two have spent a couple of years together. All four, this is the first season that they've been on the ice in this role. So it's going to come down to learning more and communicating more. And every time I watch Mikkola, you see the potential in a top four defenseman.
Yeah.
But you also see that it's going to take a little bit of growing pains to get there. Like I thought Pittsburgh game, Claves, it was a growing pains game. One, you do what you need to do against Crosby, but you got dragged into it. But on top of that, when things started to unravel, what was best about Jay Bouwmeester and Alex Pietrangelo is they were a calming presence on that blue line. In the third period, and this has been a problem all season long, when things get out of hand and they start to unravel, you don't have that calming presence on that blue line. You have kind of a sporadic, okay, let's fix this, but then you get three guys going after the puck and you leave a guy empty in front of the net. That's what I think Niko Mikkola needs to learn, to be that calming presence on the ice with Colton Parayko, to where it can be, hey, we're fine, let's focus and just get back to it.
I think you hit a good point. I think that the only way he can do that, he just got to keep playing.
Yeah, you got to learn.
Let's take a break. We'll come back. He's Alex Ferrario. It's the Ferrario Faceoff.
At St. Louis Acura, our customer-focused approach keeps earning us more inventory. As others increase their fees and take advantage of limited inventory, we keep our prices low because we remain committed to becoming better than ever and treating you as we want to be treated. We want you coming back and sending your friends and family to a veteran-owned, family-based business you can trust. Blessings for a wonderful holiday season and a prosperous new year from our families to yours. St. Louis Acura, better than ever for you.
Welcome back. Ferrario Faceoff is underway. All right, Alex, question for you. Blues lose a couple of more players to COVID. What do you see the lineup looking like at this point?
I after that game against Pittsburgh, Claves, I might be the insane one, but I looked at that game and I said, I think you might have to break up Thomas, Kyrou, and Tarasenko. And don't get me wrong, that trio worked so well together, created a lot of offense. But I think the Blues were falling back into the system of relying on one line to create all of the offense for you. It was Thomas, Kyrou, and Tarasenko. And rightfully so. I mean, these guys were scoring at a ridiculous rate in 3 games, but I felt like you needed to move guys around and try and get those other lines going. I don't know your thoughts, but that Pittsburgh game, I felt like O'Reilly, Perron, and Saad looked slow. And that is, I mean, you got a former Selke Trophy winner on that line in Ryan O'Reilly. He's going to be matching up against the McDavids, the Crosbys, the Ovechkins. He's going to be matching up against the number 1 guys. You've got to make sure you have some speed up there that can play with O'Reilly. And I just felt like Saad and Perron got caught a little off guard there for how fast Pittsburgh was playing. So now that Tarasenko is out, I think it gives Craig Berube an opportunity to experiment for these next few days. And hopefully it sounds like Tarasenko is asymptomatic, which means there's a possibility he can come out of this after 5 days, which means he'd only miss 2 games, which would be a benefit for this team. But if you don't have Tarasenko, Claves, I think you go back to the pairings. I think you stick Thomas and Kyrou together and you see if they work. I think personally, Perron and O'Reilly need to be broken up, and I think you need to put Buchnevich with O'Reilly. I mean, you acquired Buchnevich to be a top 6 winger. He has shown that he can do that. I want to see Buchnevich play with O'Reilly, and I think their line rushes after practice was Buchnevich with O'Reilly and Barbashev.
See,
I like the look of that.
That was what I was thinking. I think Barbashev is the X factor here because he's good defensively.
Agreed.
He's a very good skater, and he creates offense. He's just a guy that I think, we've always categorized him as a 3rd or 4th line guy. I think he's a guy that can be a 1 or 2 line guy, periodically. I don't know if he's a guy you do that for the whole season, but who is in the way the game is played today. So I think he's a guy that certainly gives them security when it comes to being able to do the things that, O'Reilly's a sulky guy. Okay, we know he can play defensively. Buchnevich is still trying to find his way. But when those guys become offensive minded, you've got to have a Barbashev on that line to make sure he supports the puck and be in a good position defensively. He's a guy that'll work the corners well. I like what he's been able to do. And you know what, Alex, going back to the expansion draft, and I know there was some who were like, well, why are they going to protect that guy? I think we see now why the Blues felt that Barbashev was not a guy that was expendable, which is why that you saw Jaden Schwartz end up in Seattle. And I just think this guy has really been the Swiss Army knife that this team has needed.
Yeah, I surprised a lot of people, Claves, throughout that offseason where they were saying, who do you protect in this expansion draft? And I said, look, I think you got to expose Jaden Schwartz and Vladimir Tarasenko. You got the forwards that you're going to protect, but you got to protect Barbashev. And I said you got to protect Sundqvist. Now, I know Sundqvist has been slower this season, but look, when you come off of 2 hip surgeries and an ACL injury, like, you're not coming back to the same forward that you were right away. It's going to take some time to get used to. But when Sundqvist is on his game, he and Barbashev are 2 of the most indispensable players on the roster because they play the 200-foot game. They are just as useful in the defensive zone as they are in the offensive zone. And both go to the front of the net. Both have a hell of a shot when they're healthy. They do everything. They match Craig Berube's style. So I'm not surprised seeing Barbashev perform this way. I'm a little surprised at the goals that he is producing. But if you go back and look at his juniors career, this guy was somebody who put up nearly 40 goals when he was a junior hockey player. So he's got the offense.
No, he's got touch. Yeah, he's got touch. Let me ask you about Perunovich. He came into the league like a house of fire.
Yeah.
Kind of leveled off a little bit. Where do you see him, and where do you think what he needs to do next in order to be I think he's a guy that's he could be a top 4 at one point in his career, or at some point in his career. But I don't want his minutes to be wasted. I think he's still got to find a way to insert himself and be the guy that we saw in the first couple of games, where he can move the puck. He's a good skater. He does a lot of things, and he seems like he's got some real good leadership skills also. But where do you see his role at this point?
This is going to be the most interesting one to scout between now and March 21st, Claves, which is the trade deadline, because everyone, if you're a Blues fans, looking at it saying, boy, they need help defensively. And maybe that changes the more Mikkola and Parayko play together. But here's the deal. I mean, you got Torrey Krug for 6 more years at $6.5 million. You got Colton Parayko for 6 more years at $6.5 million. And you got Justin Falk at the same price. It's hard to look at it and say, well, these guys are going to be trade assets. I think they're here for the long term. For Scott Perunovich, he's very identical to Torrey Krug. And I think you got to decide what the identity is for this Blues defense. Are you going to try and get back to that rough and tumbler type of team that plays nasty in front of the net, or are you going to go more speed and finesse? For Scott Perunovich, I mean, look, the guy dominated the AHL. I think he's still like top 10 in scoring in the American Hockey League, and he hasn't been down there in nearly, a month now? So he's got the touch. He's not going to do anything else in the AHL to prove he's an NHL player. But for Scott Perunovich, I think it's figuring out who you are on this Blues team. I'm with you. Craig Berube's ability to transition young players into pros has been proven since he's been as a head coach. Scott Perunovich is going to be the next example. I think Perunovich is a top 4 defenseman. I think people need to alter their expectations. He's never going to be Cale Makar, so you're not going to see a guy who's on pace for 44 goals on the defensive side, but he's a guy who's good offensively.
He might have 44 assists, though.
He could. And that's what he was so good at Springfield, Claves. I remember talking with the play-by-play guy for the Springfield Thunderbirds, and I also remember talking to their head coach, Drew Bannister. He said his ability to find open ice and to find pucks to the net is untouchable in the American Hockey League. He said he's one of the best, and he's played 1 season there. So he's going to create offense. My only question is, how does he and Torrey Krug play in this system? Because you have 2 guys that are small, 2 guys that are offensive-minded. Do you want to go that route, or do you need a more physical presence? I think that's the biggest question Perunovich has to answer.
Well, I think here's the bigger question. And I think I've got the answer to your question. You got to make sure he's paired with the right guy.
Yeah.
I think Bortuzzo has always been an X factor for me. I love the guy and love his play. I love his grit. You take a run. If he's playing with Perunovich, he's going to say, hey, kid, go up. Go do what you have to do. I got the back end. And if anybody wants to lay some lumber on him, they're going to have to answer to Bortuzzo.
Right.
I think, and here's the thing. The Blues don't have anybody else standing around that's willing to do that. Mm-hmm. We've seen the minor leagues now, okay? We've seen everybody in the minor leagues. I haven't seen one guy that even remotely looks like Bortuzzo when it comes to physical presence and protecting his defense partner. So I think that at some point, Bortuzzo's the guy that I think Perunovich needs to play with. Scandella is a serviceable defenseman. That's all he is. He's a serviceable guy. He had a little bit of a cold streak there where he just wasn't playing well. But I think overall he is what he is, and that doesn't make him a bad guy. I think he's a guy that ends up being a spare part when you have a really legitimate sixth defenseman. And that sixth guy we're talking about, I think right now is Bortuzzo from a physical presence standpoint. And he's a guy that can clear the net. He's going to give a guy like Perunovic a chance to jump in a play. He's going to give Perunovic some room to skate and making sure that first pass he makes is going to be a good one. So that's the guy I think they've got to find a way to keep healthy and keep his confidence up, because I think he's a real key. He's one of the real leaders on this hockey team from where I sit.
Yeah, it's a tough blow, too, with Perunovic going on the COVID list, because I was really interested to see what that looked like Friday against the Capitals, Claves, because I fully expected Bortuzzo to get back into the lineup and Scandella be a healthy scratch just so he can watch from up top. I think Scandella, and I think he's basically what Joel Edmondson was for this Blues team.
Yeah.
Edmondson was willing to drop the gloves. I think Scandella is as well, but we haven't seen it. But, I mean, they're guys that can play in your top four if you need them to. They're guys that are great in your third pair, but they're also guys that are awesome to have as a seventh defenseman like Joel Edmondson was. But Bortuzzo, to me, is a Carl Gunnarsson. He's a guy that you can put in any situation, and he's going to pay off for you. So I think for Perunovic, the goal this season is just to prove that you can stay in the lineup on a consistent basis. And Berube's talked about wanting to see more defensive play from Scott Perunovic. The goal is to show you can do that, Claves. And next year, I think the goal is to show you can be a top four.
I agree with you. Let's take a final break. We'll come back and wrap things up with Alex Ferrario. It's the Ferrario Faceoff.
You know, the only thing faster than this supersonic golf cart are the closing times at thehomeloanexpert.com. Mortgage rates on the twos, and we have a 21-day closing guarantee. Apply online today at thehomeloanexpert.com.
Final segment with Alex Ferrario. All right, what else is going on around the league that we need to be aware of?
You know, let's start with the trade speculation, Clays, because, I mean, I mentioned to you Perunovic is going to be interesting moving towards the March 21st trade deadline. And, you know, we've spoke with a couple of trade analysts and insiders around the NHL for the last couple of days on our midday show. And they've all talked about how, you know, the Blues might be one big defenseman away from the NHL. And the name that's popped up is Jacob Chychrun. And Jacob Chychrun's an intriguing one. Yeah, that's right.
His dad was a rough customer with the Flyers.
And he was very close friends with Jeff Brown, of course, the former Blues defenseman and dad of Logan Brown. So people have connected Jacob Chychrun to the Blues. I think it's going to cost an arm and a leg. But when you got a guy who's 23 years old, he was projected to be on Team Canada's Olympic team before the season even began. So it tells you what they think of him as an overall defenseman. I think that's going to be interesting. One, the names that are going to pop up on the trade speculation claims between now and March. But two, if teams are able to pull off trades, because between COVID and how much money is available for the salary cap, I don't know how much wheeling and dealing we're going to see this season.
I think, you know what? I think you're going to see that with a lot of teams. I think a lot of teams right there on the brink like the Blues are. So you really trading contract for contract. So that's where the challenge comes into play. You know, it's not like you can do future considerations very much. You're going to have to move you're going to have to move a big contract and take on another one. I think what you're going to see some teams do is maybe take on a bad contract that's at the end, and that frees up cap money for them for next year. You know, you may see a guy get bought out somewhere along the way also. But I think that the league has really restricted itself with regard to movement because of the cap, because teams just don't have the flexibility that you would like to have. And, you know, it is what it is. I mean, these are the rules. I think, though, this year in the offseason, they're going to have to get in the room and figure out some things when it comes to the roster situation and COVID, maybe a little bit more cap flexibility somewhere along the way. But, you know, as good of a manager as you are of the cap, you're still going to run into these situations because you're kind of limited.
Yeah, well, and these things aren't going anywhere as of now. And, I mean, look, we're seeing it in Canada right now with them having to postpone games and figure out when they're going to reschedule. I think they're up to like 90-something games
92.
now. 92
games.
I mean, you got 92 games to reschedule, and I know you get those 2 or 3 weeks that you had in February with the Olympics, but
there ain't enough days on the calendar to get it all done at that time. And
not at all.
Here's the other challenge that you run into. Just because you have those days on the calendar doesn't mean the all clear has been given for COVID. So you're really kind of stuck. throw in the fact that when you look at this situation, you can't compress too many games because this is how guys get hurt, you know, and we've seen the remnants of that already with the beginning of the season and how many games they had and nobody was having a chance to practice and the recovery time wasn't what it normally is. They could ill afford to lose guys because of the compressed schedule and then going into the playoffs. I mean, you know, you can lose a guy in October, November. Maybe you get him back in February. You lose a guy in February or March, you're done. You know, and there are too many teams in this league that are fighting for a playoff position. You know, that just says a lot about the league. There are only a handful of bad teams. Everybody else is scrambling. And there's going to be a good team that's going to probably watch the playoffs on TV because they're going to come up a point, maybe 2 points short.
You know, one of those teams, guys, and this is the last one I wanted to touch on with you. The Edmonton Oilers are fascinating. I mean, you can't afford, if you're the NHL, to not have Connor McDavid in the playoffs because he's just that good. But the problem now is the goaltending for Edmonton. I mean, they're 2-9-2 in their last 13 games. And I'm sure you saw this, but their goaltender, Mikko Koskinen, kind of called out his team the other day.
Yeah.
The Oilers lose. Koskinen afterward and said, I don't know what else you want me to do. We scored 2 goals in the game. I can't score goals. If Edmonton is going to be a playoff team, they got to make a trade for a goaltender. The one that's interesting to me is Gibson or Marc-Andre Fleury.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I think that both of those guys would be interesting. Yeah. The Hawks aren't going anywhere.
No.
And Fleury's a good player. Maybe give him one more crack at getting in the postseason. I've always been a Gibson fan. You know, the Ducks, I think, have surprised some teams, some people with their play this year. I think a lot of people thought they were going to rebuild. They weren't going to be talented enough, but they've turned out to have some pretty good games under their belt. And Gibson's that guy. Now, the challenge for Gibson is being in postseason. It's been a while since he's been there. But I think that you're right. Edmonton's got to do something, and they better do it soon. Because once you get a toxic dressing room where guys start, you know, laying the blame on somebody else, then you got bigger issues at hand. And, you know, there's no excuse when you've got McDavid and Draisaitl, 2 of the most dynamic players in the game on one team, and some other good players to go along with it. It starts in goal. You're absolutely right. I mean, I like the makeup of that team. You know, I look at a guy like Zach Kassian. You don't think Kassian would be a good role player on a team like the Blues because of his physical presence? Yeah, but here's a question. Who do you take out?
Right.
If you got a Blues lineup. I mean, you look at their line, you say, man, everybody deserves to play. You know, everybody's a good player. But my point going back to Edmonton, they got too many good things working for them not to be able to go out and find a goalie. Now they may have to give up a lot to get one, but you got to make sure you get the right one. I think they felt like they could slip and slide a little bit with Mike Smith. You know, Mike Smith was a good goaltender at one point, but Mike Smith's good enough to give up a bad goal every night, and you can't have it anymore in this league.
Well, you can't do what – and look, I mean, I thought that at the time in 2014 it was a right move, but you can't do what the Blues did. You got to get the right goalie, like you said. You can't go get Ryan Miller and think he's the right guy.
That's the same guy I was thinking of. You're right.
I mean, you get a guy that you think could be the right guy, and then he doesn't pan out, and you find yourself out in the first round. You got to make sure if you're going to spend the money, you got to spend the money on the right goaltender. That's why Marc-Andre Fleury screams the one to me. One, you're back in the West, or you're in the West now with Chicago, but you're on a team that's contending. But more so than anything, you're on a team that's going to be in the playoffs, and I think that brings a little bit more incentive into your game.
I agree. All right, Alex, it's been fun, man. We got a lot of things covered. Blues are in action. A long homestand, as you mentioned, so people don't have a reason not to go out and see them other than the weather. But in any event, and they're going to have some good teams they're going to face too. And I think that's what's going to be fun. You got Washington, you got the Stars. Those are 2 games you definitely want to see. Then you get Seattle. You get Seattle next week as well. So you're going to have some fun games in store. You get Calgary as well. So, you know, it's going to be some good hockey going on in St. Louis.
100%. And I think if you want to see if this team can measure up against the playoff teams, if the Blues go from dark horse to an actual contender, you're going to see that in these next 5 games, specifically with Washington, Toronto, and Nashville.
Yeah. And you know what? Seattle is a blood donor.
Yes, hopefully. Yeah, last time we said that the Blues lost to Arizona.
That's a good point. That's a good point. All right, he's Alex Ferrario. I'm Mike Claiborne. We thank you for checking us out here on Claves Online. And he is this has been the Ferrario Faceoff. Have a great day.